Marcus Reed woke up at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, not because his alarm went off, but because something inside him had been quietly screaming for months. He lay in the center of a California king bed, in a penthouse that cost more per night than most people earned in a year, staring at a ceiling he had never once truly appreciated. The silence around him was immaculate. Climate-controlled. Curated. And completely hollow. He was worth $11 billion. He felt worth nothing. Not in a dramatic way, not the kind of emptiness that makes headlines or fills therapy couches on television dramas. It was quieter than that. More persistent. Like a radio signal just out of reach, something he couldn't quite tune into no matter how many zeros appeared in his quarterly portfolio report. He had everything every financial advisor, every motivational poster, every childhood dream had ever promised. The penthouse. The jet. The foundation with his name engraved above the entrance in polished bronze letters. And yet, somewhere between his third acquisition and his seventh magazine cover, Marcus Reed had stopped feeling the ground beneath his feet. He sat up. Swung his legs over the edge of the bed. And made a decision that would change his life before the sun had even fully risen over San Francisco. He would disappear. Not permanently. Not in any way his board of directors needed to be notified about. Just for one day. One honest, unguarded, anonymous day, out there, in the world his money claimed to be improving. Because the truth was, Marcus had written the checks. He had signed the grant approvals and attended the ribbon cuttings and smiled in every photograph beside every dignitary and community leader. His foundation pumped $50 million annually into homeless outreach programs, soup kitchens, transitional housing initiatives, and after-school programs across the Bay Area. $50 million. With his name on it. But he had never once sat in the street and watched what his money actually did. He moved through his closet like a man on a mission, bypassing the Italian suits and the cashmere overcoats, digging to the very back where a forgotten box sat, items a stylist had sourced 2 years ago for a charity gala that required guests to dress down. He pulled out a torn gray jacket, a faded flannel shirt, a pair of worn jeans with a split seam along the left knee. He found an old pair of boots he hadn't worn since college, scuffed and creased with age. He dressed slowly, deliberately, like he was putting on armor in reverse, stripping away every layer of identity he had spent 3 decades constructing. Then he stood at the bathroom mirror and did something that made him pause. He reached into a drawer, found a stick of black eyeliner his girlfriend had left behind 6 months ago, and used it to shadow the hollows beneath his eyes. He rubbed a thin layer of ash from a candle dish along his jaw, dulling the glow of his twice-weekly facials. He roughed up his hair, which normally cost $300 to style, and pressed it flat and sideways against his head. He removed his watch, the one worth more than a small house, and set it on the counter with a quiet click that sounded, in the silence of that morning, almost like a period at the end of a sentence. He looked in the mirror for a long moment. A stranger looked back. Good. He took a rideshare to the Mission District, not his private car, not the black SUV with the tinted windows, just a regular app-based ride, booked from a secondary phone his assistant used for logistics. He asked the driver to drop him 2 blocks from the destination. He didn't want to arrive in a clean vehicle. He walked the rest of the way slowly, with his shoulders curved forward and his chin slightly down, the way he had observed people walk when they were trying to take up less space in the world. The Hargrove Community Soup Kitchen sat on the corner of Dolores and 18th Street. His foundation had funded its complete renovation 3 years ago, new kitchen equipment, expanded seating, a small resource library in the back where people could use computers and access job placement services. From the outside, it looked clean and functional. A small plaque beside the door read, "Supported by the Reed Foundation." He noticed that the plaque was slightly crooked. He had never noticed that before, because he had only ever seen it from a distance, standing straight and smiling. He chose a bench across the street and sat. For the first hour, he simply watched. Volunteers arrived in the early morning chill, unlocking doors and hauling supplies from a side entrance. A line began forming before the doors even opened, men and women of every age, some in groups, some alone, some clutching paper cups of gas station coffee like small warm anchors. A man in his 60s sat at the far end of the bench, head bowed, methodically turning a coin over and over in his fingers. A young mother stood near the wall, her toddler pressed against her hip, both of them watching the door with a kind of patient, practiced stillness that Marcus felt reach directly into his chest and squeeze. Nobody looked at Marcus. That was the first thing he noticed, truly noticed, in his body, not just his mind. In his real life, people always looked at him. They tracked him when he entered rooms. They straightened when he spoke. Assistants anticipated his movements. Strangers recognized his face from magazine profiles and technology conferences. He had not experienced genuine invisibility since his 20s, and even then, only briefly. Now he was completely, utterly unseen. A security guard from a neighboring business walked past the bench twice, eyes drifting over Marcus with the casual dismissal reserved for things one has already decided are not worth full attention. A couple walked by with a dog, an expensive breed, gleaming coat, and the woman subtly pulled the leash tighter as they passed, redirecting the animal without breaking her conversation. A teenager on a bicycle veered wide around the bench without looking up from his phone, as though proximity itself was something to be avoided. Then a restaurant manager emerged from the bistro 3 doors down. He walked directly toward Marcus with the energy of someone executing a routine task. He pointed at a laminated sign affixed to the wall beside the bench. No loitering. Private property. He didn't say it rudely. He didn't need to. The gesture was enough, flat, efficient, impersonal, the kind of interaction designed to move a problem from one location to another without requiring the problem to be acknowledged as a human being. Marcus stood up and moved. He crossed the street and found a spot along a low concrete wall near a bus stop. He sat there, watching the soup kitchen, watching the line grow. His back ached against the concrete. The morning air was colder down here, closer to the ground, less sheltered than he expected. He thought about the heated floors in his penthouse. He thought about the espresso machine that started automatically every morning at 7, filling his kitchen with the smell of something warm before he ever arrived. He had been sitting for 2 hours and 40 minutes when she appeared. A girl, maybe 15, maybe 16, in a school uniform that had clearly been worn for several years beyond its original fit. The blazer was neat but threadbare at the elbows, and her shoes, Marcus noticed, had been repaired along the right sole with a strip of silver duct tape, pressed carefully flat and trimmed close to the edge, as though the repair itself had been made with a kind of quiet pride. Her hair was pulled back. She carried a backpack that sagged with what must have been a full day's worth of textbooks. She sat down next to Marcus on the concrete wall without hesitation. Not near him. Next to him. The way you sit beside someone you have already decided is worth sitting beside. She opened her backpack, pulled out a lunch bag, and looked inside it for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus. Not at his jacket or his shoes or the ash on his jaw, she looked at his face. Directly. The way people almost never did anymore. "You look like you haven't eaten," she said. It was not pity. It was not performance. It was just a sentence delivered with the same natural simplicity as a weather observation, as though noticing hunger in another person and responding to it was simply the obvious thing to do. She reached into the lunch bag and removed a sandwich. Without ceremony, without pause, she broke it in half along the seam and held out the larger piece. Marcus Reed, the man whose name was on a plaque 40 feet away, the man who had signed checks large enough to fund entire city programs, reached out and accepted half a sandwich from a teenage girl in taped-up shoes. His hand was trembling slightly. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and simply understood. Either way, she sat with him in the morning cold and ate her half quietly, watching the street, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. For Marcus Reed, it was the most significant moment in $11 billion worth of living. And the story, the real one, was only just beginning. Marcus held the sandwich with both hands and could not remember the last time food had felt like a gift. Not a catered appetizer at a rooftop function. Not a tasting menu prepared by a Michelin-starred chef flown in for a private dinner. Not even the simple meals his mother used to make in their 2-room apartment in Oakland, back when he was small and the world was large and money was something other people had. This was different from all of those things. This was half a sandwich from a stranger who had nothing to spare and had chosen to spare it anyway, and the weight of that, the specific, quiet, devastating weight of that, settled into Marcus's chest like something he had been waiting years to feel. He took a small bite. Turkey and mustard on plain white bread. It was the best thing he had tasted in a decade. The girl sat beside him with her half, eating slowly, watching the street the way young people rarely do anymore, not through a screen, not filtered through anything, just watching it directly, openly, as though the world outside was worth the full attention of both eyes. Marcus studied her profile without being obvious about it. The school uniform blazer, navy blue with a faded crest on the breast pocket. The careful repair job on her shoe, that precise strip of silver tape that somehow conveyed more dignity than carelessness. The backpack, heavy with textbooks, leaning against her leg like a faithful companion. She was not performing kindness. That was what struck him most deeply. In Marcus's world, generosity was almost always performed. Checks written at galas. Donations announced at press events. Foundations named after families who wanted the naming rights as much as the tax relief. He had participated in all of it, had built an entire public identity from it, and he had told himself for years that the outcome was what mattered, that the motive behind the money was secondary to the good it produced. But sitting on this concrete wall, holding this sandwich, he was no longer entirely sure he believed that. This girl had simply seen a person who looked hungry and responded to that fact. No audience. No recognition. No bronze plaque. He finished the last of his half and folded the wrapper neatly in his hand, not knowing what else to do with it. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out rougher than expected, scraped thin by the cold morning air and something else he couldn't name. She glanced at him and nodded once, easy and unbothered. Then, after a beat, she said, "I do this every day. Come here before school. There's always someone on this block who looks like they need half of something." Marcus turned that sentence over in his mind slowly, the way you turn something fragile. Someone who looks like they need half of something. Not a project. Not a cause. Just a person. Just half. "Every day," he said. "Every day I have something worth splitting," she said simply. He wanted to ask her more, everything, in fact, but he moved carefully, aware that he was a grown man in a disguise asking questions of a teenage girl, and that the wrong approach would end the conversation before it revealed what it seemed to be quietly promising to reveal. So he let the silence sit between them for a moment, comfortable and unhurried, and then he asked the only question that felt honest enough to deserve an answer. "Why?" She looked at the ground for a moment, the way people do when the answer lives somewhere close to the surface but still requires a breath before it can be spoken. "My mom lost her job last winter," she said. "We had nothing. Like, actually nothing. I don't mean it the way people say it when they mean they can't afford a vacation. I mean the lights were off and the refrigerator was empty and my mom was sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning trying to figure out which bill to not pay so we could eat that week." Marcus said nothing. He listened the way he had forgotten how to listen, completely, without planning his response. Then one day a delivery showed up at our door. Groceries. A full month's worth. Good stuff too, not just basics. Nobody knocked. There was no note. We never found out who did it. She paused. My mom cried for about an hour. Then she made dinner and we ate together and she said that whoever did that would never know what it meant to us, and that the only way to honor it was to pass it forward. She looked back up at the street. "So that's what I do." Marcus felt something happen behind his eyes, a pressure, sudden and inconvenient, the physiological precursor to emotion he had trained himself out of in boardrooms and negotiations and the thousand small moments where appearing unmoved was a form of power. He breathed through it slowly. He looked at the soup kitchen across the street with his name on a crooked plaque above the door. He had funded that building. He had approved every budget line. He had shaken hands at the opening ceremony and said things into a microphone about community and dignity and the responsibility of success. And yet it had taken a girl in taped-up shoes to teach him what any of it actually meant. "What's your name?" he asked. "Destiny," she said, and almost smiled, as though she was aware of how the name sounded given everything she had just said. My mom had a sense of humor. "Marcus," he said. "Just Marcus. No last name. No title." She stood up, swung her backpack onto both shoulders, and adjusted the straps with the practiced efficiency of someone who has carried heavy things a long time. "You should go to the kitchen," she said, nodding across the street. "They open in 10 minutes and the oatmeal is actually really good on Tuesdays. I checked once." She said it without irony, without condescension, just practical, useful information delivered from one person to another. Then she walked away toward the bus stop at the end of the block, her taped shoe quiet on the pavement, her backpack full of textbooks, her lunch bag now empty and folded back into the front pocket with the same quiet care she seemed to apply to everything. Marcus watched her go. He sat on the concrete wall for another 20 minutes after she disappeared, not moving, not checking his phone, not doing anything at all except letting the morning exist around him. A city bus wheezed past. The soup kitchen doors opened and the line began to move slowly forward. The man with the coin was still turning it over in his fingers at the far end of the bench, and now a volunteer had come out and was speaking to him gently, touching his shoulder once. Marcus stood, eventually, and walked. He walked for a long time, through streets he had driven past in SUVs for years without truly seeing, past schools and laundromats and corner stores and the specific, unremarkable architecture of daily life that $11 billion had slowly insulated him from. He walked until the ash on his jaw had dried in the wind and his boots had reminded his feet that he was not accustomed to pavement, and by the time he arrived back at the neighborhood where a driver was waiting to take him home, he had made 3 decisions so quietly and so certainly that they didn't feel like decisions at all. They felt like corrections. He went home and removed the ash from his face and stood at his bathroom mirror for a long time. The stranger in the torn jacket looked back at him, and for the first time in years, Marcus recognized the men behind the stranger's eyes, someone who had started with nothing and somewhere along the way had confused having everything with understanding anything. He picked up his watch from the counter and did not put it on. That evening, he called his foundation director and asked for a specific piece of information, not donor reports, not impact metrics, not the glossy annual summary designed for press releases. He asked for a list of every school in the Mission District and the surrounding neighborhoods with documented records of students whose families had applied for tuition assistance and been waitlisted due to insufficient funding. The list was longer than he expected. It always is, when you finally ask the right question. The next morning, Marcus Reed did not send a check. He did not issue a press release or notify his communications team or arrange for a photographer to document the moment. He got into a car, a regular one, and drove himself to the first school on the list. He walked into the administrative office in a plain jacket and asked to speak with whoever handled financial assistance for families. The receptionist looked at him the way the city had looked at him the morning before, without recognition, without particular interest. It was the best feeling in the world. By the end of that week, full 4-year tuition had been secured for every waitlisted student in 6 schools across the district. No announcement. No plaque. No press coverage. The letters that arrived in those families' mailboxes said only that an anonymous donor had ensured their children's education was fully funded, and that no repayment of any kind was expected or desired. Somewhere in the Mission District, a girl named Destiny opened a letter on a Tuesday morning and read that her own tuition, the one her mother had privately despaired over for 2 years, had been paid in full by someone unknown. She read it twice. Then she made her lunch, split it in half, and walked to school. Some people receive grace and are softened by it. Some people receive grace and become it. Marcus Reed, $11 billion into his life, was only now learning which kind of person he intended to be.